How is everyone doing today? Welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we've been doing a lot of Bible decodes over the last few months, mostly going under the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. That is, that the New Testament was written by the Caesars, the Flavian dynasty of Caesars, who ruled the Roman Empire from 69 to 96 AD. That includes Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Titus and Domitian. And the first two of those were involved in this war against the Jews, as they were generals that they fought for the Romans, and then eventually they became the emperor. But they were both wounded in this war, and they were fighting the Jews, and the Romans had taken over in Judea like in about 63 BC, and for over a century had been a total pain for the Romans to deal with. Super high maintenance, constant revolts and revolutions and riots and uprisings. The Jews didn't like to have their rituals messed with. They had a jealous and zealous monotheistic God that called them the chosen people, and they had a lot of rituals and beliefs that clashed with the Romans' intentions, such as their stricture against graven images, where the Romans wanted to put Caesar in the temple because the Romans wanted to absorb all the religions. They wanted you to have freedom of religion as long as you worship Caesar too. And the circumcision and the kosher food laws and the animal sacrifices were all kind of just too much for the Romans to really want to continue, especially once this war broke out in 66 AD, when some zealots like Simon, Eleazar, and John, zealot Jews, got together and got their forces together and kicked the Herod puppet government that were Roman, at least half Roman, out of Jerusalem. And so Emperor Nero called in General Vespasian and told him to go to Jerusalem and stop the uprising. Well, Vespasian was there for 3 years. Eventually he became the new emperor after Nero and 3 other emperors were assassinated. Then he appointed his son Titus to be the new emperor, to be the new general. And it took Titus 3 more years to finally subdue the Jews. So it stands to reason that the Romans, who were quite adept at psychological operations and psychological warfare and propaganda, that they would write the New Testament. Now just remember, the Jews were waiting for a Messiah. They were hoping in the first century that a Messiah would come and help kick out the Romans. And Simon, Eleazar, and John fit the bill. They got all that started. Now, they didn't quite finish the job, and all of them ended up having bad circumstances at the end. But, you know, this was a real threat for the Romans. And so they wrote a story of a Jewish Messiah who instead was a Prince of Peace and believed in turning the other cheek to oppression of rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, of walking an extra mile with the Roman soldiers' pack, of believing that the Roman slave owner had the greatest faith in all of Israel, and to exhort his God to forgive the Romans, for they know not what they do. While at the very same time, during his same ministry, he's out there in front of the Jewish temple overturning the tables of the Jewish money changers, who are changing the Roman coins with graven images on them to Jewish coins so they can be brought into temple for the offering, and upsetting the commerce of the Jews, who were selling pigeons and doves and so on for animal sacrifices to be done inside the temple. So Jesus was the Roman Jesus, the one that we read about in the New Testament, was against or anti these Jewish rituals, while at the same time being never ever doing anything against Rome during the entire Gospels. Everything that he does where he's uppity in some way is against the Jews. So that certainly is a feather in the cap of the Roman origins hypothesis, but it's just the beginning, because then you must also consider that the Romans had a monopoly, first, on Greek. Very few Jews spoke Greek, only the upper crust of the society. Jesus, had he existed, would have been speaking in Aramaic and presumably writing in Aramaic with the Hebrew letters. But the Gospels are in Greek. And that was the language of the Romans. They spoke both Greek, and the elites also spoke Latin and wrote in Latin. But Greek was kind of the common language in Rome. The Romans also had a monopoly on censorship. If something is going to be published in the Roman Empire in the 1st century, it had to have met the approval of Caesar. They also had a monopoly on publishing. There was nobody else within the Roman Empire who had thousands of slaves to copy documents over and over and over and over again, to get the kind of volume for these scriptures that we still find, that we find archaeologically. And the Romans had a monopoly on distribution. They had the only postal service in the Roman Empire. And so don't exactly ask me who is going to be delivering the epistles of Paul to these all these different churches that he's sending out his letters to. Only the Romans are going to be circulating anything, much less a sect of fishermen and other Jewish commoners who believed in poverty. But that's just this kind of circumstantial evidence. The real evidence we get to when we look at the work of Michael Menescot's here, among many other authors, but we're looking at his book called Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult, which came out back in late 2024. And the way that the Romans did it is that they wrote the New Testament and they backdated it by 40 years. So they set Jesus's ministry from 30 to 33 AD. And at the same time, they wrote a history of this war against the Jews. They called it War of the Jews. And they wrote it under the name of Josephus. And Josephus was said to, according to his autobiography, he wrote a number of books. It says that he was a Jewish general in the war and a priest, and he surrendered to Vespasian. When he did so, he had the feeling that the Romans are now favored by God over the Jews, and so he defected to the Romans. He predicted that General Vespasian would one day become emperor. And when General Vespasian did become emperor, he stopped and pardoned Josephus, brought him to Rome, made him one of the court historians, and adopted him as a member of his family. And so now he's known as Flavius Josephus of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars. He lived in a townhouse at Caesar's palace for the rest of his life. And if you read War of the Jews, you will get a deja vu because there's so much in there that is reminiscent of things that are in the New Testament. And so that's what Menescats did. And you can see many themes developing. So one theme is the parallelism of Titus and Jesus. Jesus has a 3-year ministry in Judea. Titus has a 3-year military campaign in Judea. Josephus follows the military campaign of Titus in Judea. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus also goes in the same order. And every place that they go, they have parallel occurrences or events that happen to them. They're the same events conceptually. They're not the same events specifically, but conceptually. Also, many, over a dozen things that Jesus prophesies in the New Testament are literally fulfilled by Titus, according to the text of Josephus in War of the Jews. And so that sets up the poison pill that Titus is the second coming of Jesus. And Jesus also has many, many parallels to the life of Josephus, the military campaign of Josephus before he surrendered to Vespasian. He describes it autobiographically in his War of the Jews, and many, many very long list of things are parallel between Josephus's life and Jesus's life, including being buried for 3 days and rising again. But what Menescats does is he looks particularly at the book of Luke and the third gospel, and in relationship to War of the Jews. And he looks for parallels. Took him like 4 years of digging through the book of Luke, and he found, and also Josephus, because Josephus is in 7 volumes. The short volumes, but it's a long work. It's as long as, it's longer than the Gospels are. Probably twice as long. And he looks for parallels. He found 250 plus parallels in the book of Luke. Not mentioning the rest of the New Testament, just in the book of Luke. That's over 10 per chapter. And not only that, and some of them will knock your socks off. Some of them are admittedly kind of weak, and some of them are slightly interesting, and some of them are probably just there to fill out the pattern, because he intuited that there was some kind of pattern involved, and so he graphed out all of the parallels that he found. He put the book of Luke on the vertical axis, War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. Every time he found a parallel, he plotted the point corresponding to that place where the parallel is. When he was done, he looked and saw that he had made 5 near-perfect letters in Latin, the language of the Roman royals. And those letters are A, P, T, V, S. The AP is quite questionable. There are a few different candidates for what the AP stands for. The TVS is pretty obviously Titus Vespasianus, the 2 Roman emperors, and they used the same imprint on coins from the period. So it's not like we're just making this up. This imprint this isn't the first place that the imprint has been seen, but it is APTVS. So not only did the Romans write the New Testament, but they signed their name to it. So, you know, right now, almost 2,000 years later, they have to be right. You get it yet? We wrote it. Please recognize this. This is a trap. You have been ensnared into a trap, and we're mocking you, because the Romans were mean-spirited and bawdy and pornographic and violent and pedophilic and homosexual, and all of this is in the New Testament, in code, but you're not looking for it, so you don't see it. Some of it is pretty blatant, in fact, as well, too. And it's stinging, mocking, stinging and ridiculing. The original intent was to sting and ridicule the Jews, but the corollary is that it also does the same to anybody in the future who also believes this. So we're going to go through some of the parallels that Menescot finds here, but we are in the A and the P. I think the A right here. And admittedly, according to Menescot, these parallels are not nearly as strong as some of the parallels in the V and the S. This has got him to conclude that the War of the Jews was written in 2 installments, at least, maybe 3, and that the V and the S, and possibly the T, were written first, and were written with a great deal of care, because the parallels are much more interesting and detailed and intricate. But the parallels in the A and the P are relatively elementary and are kind of just there to fill out a pattern for whoever AP is to kind of put their imprint on the whole thing. And this makes sense because the 66 AD start time for the war doesn't really happen until book 3 or 4 of War of the Jews. And so the A and the P could be just it goes all the way back to 100 BC or something like that. So that books 1 and 2 are just kind of a lead up. And so they were probably thrown together at a later period, possibly by a later emperor, possibly by Domitian, or possibly by the shadow emperor named Arius Piso. Domitian often went by the Holy Ghost, Aegion Pneuma. That's pneuma with a P, like pneumonia. So some of these are pretty simple and not so interesting parallels. Jewish War 122, Book 1, Chapter 18, Paragraph 1. The Jews in Jerusalem were divided into several factions, and bold men got together and robbed others because there was no food. Matched up with Luke 11:17. He said, "Every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation, and a house divided against a house falls." Also Luke 12:51-52. "Do you think I am come to give peace on earth? No, rather division. For now on there shall be 5 in one house divided." So that's hardly a parallel at all, I would say. He's going to get 2 dots for that, though. One in Luke 11 and one in Luke 12. Okay, Jewish War 123. After battering walls down, then Herod's men finally got over Jerusalem's wall, ending the siege, and they seized upon around the temple, and no mercy was shown to infants, nor to ... Luke 11:5. And he arrived at midnight, and he from within shall answer and say, Trouble me not, the door is now shut. The door is now shut, and my children are with me in bed. I cannot rise and give you. And yet despite this, he must rise. Knock, and it shall be opened. That is pornographic right there. That is gay pedophilia right there. In code right there for you to look at. And that also matches with battering walls down, with knock and it shall be opened. No mercy was shown to infants on both, in both, and that's really about it. The door is now shut. Now the door is open. So anyway, when the Romans talk about rising, that refers to an erection. And when they talk about dying, that refers to not having an erection. And this is from Jewish War 125, and expanded upon by Antiquities of the Jews, which is Josephus's 20-volume work that he wrote later in the 90s AD. This is book 15, chapter 2 to 96, in which describes how, although John Hyrcanus was unable to receive the high priesthood, Herod gave Hyrcanus the upper place at public meetings. And that's Luke 11:43. Woe to you, Pharisees, for ye love the uppermost seats in the synagogues and greetings in the markets. Okay, that's real bare bones parallel right there, but it's just for the purposes of a dot. Obviously, it could be coincidental, but when there are hundreds of them, then you can kind of recognize that they're intentional and they're there just to get a dot. This is Jewish War 126. This is all on the right-hand side of the A, like the diagonal line. So as we move forward in Jewish War, we're moving backward in Luke. Antony had reclaimed some of the territory, especially the palm grove at Jericho, where the balsam grows, and presented them to Cleopatra. And Antiquities of the Jews expands on this, saying, this country bears palm trees, but also the balsam, which is the most precious drug, and which grows there in Jericho. A balsam is a medicinal plant resin mix, generally including alcohol and oil, he says parenthetically. And this is paired up with Luke 10:33. A certain Samaritan journeyed and saw the man and had compassion, and went and bound up his wounds, pouring in oil and wine, and set him on his own beast, and took care of him. So he says, a mixture of oil and wine beaten together is widely regarded as among the best balsams for a fresh wound. Okay, so that's a pretty interesting parallel, but it's like you have to have a lot of background information to be able to understand that. Now, Menescott points out that sometimes Josephus goes to Antiquities of the Jews, his other work, the 20-volume work, and he sometimes also employs his own autobiography, which is called Vita. These were written, I believe, in a later period, so it's kind of, over here on the A, I can understand these things happening in the A, but he calls those synoptic. Synoptic Josephus, and just in the same way Luke sometimes uses the other synoptic gospels to add to his decoding. Sometimes he draws on things that are written in Mark and Matthew that will provide the connections that you need to make the parallel. Okay, this is Jewish War 126. Again, in addition to the tract of land with the balsam, he took many of those cities for Cleopatra, except Tyre and Sidon. Reflecting the Roman treatment of Tyre and Sidon was more tolerable than elsewhere. Which is matched by Luke 10:14, but it shall be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon at the judgment than for you. Okay, so it's just a dot. Jewish War 125, 126 is expanded on by Antiquities 15:2, and Antiquities 246 says that Cleopatra had 2 coffins prepared for her and her son to be placed in, to be conveyed onto a ship. The young man was enclosed in wood on water to escape Herod. Later Antiquities says that Herod then caught them and arranged for the son to be drowned in a large fish pond. He then died in water. You have to remember that fish are often used within the Gospels and War of the Jews as a metaphor for Jews. Matched up with Luke 8:27. And when he went forth to land, there met him out of the city a certain man which had devils a long time, and wore no clothes, and he neither abode in any house but in the tombs. He says the link here is unusually well hidden, but relates to a metaphor I have seen within the story suggesting that General John the Zealot was killed by a form of torture known as Sisyphism, which involves being trapped to decay within 2 opposed boat hulls, forming a living tomb. So again, you have to have a lot of background knowledge to do this, to understand this. The Romans, you can kind of take for granted that they had this background knowledge or had access to it. I can imagine that they're reading this at Caesar's palace and laughing about it, laughing about the various mockeries. But you have to understand that the Romans, and to a certain extent the Jews, allegory was a science, and poetry and riddle and rhyme and aliases and name switching and language switching and puns and riddles and codes. These were great amusements to the Romans. They thrived on this. This was like watching television for them. So, maybe nobody discovered this parallel for a little while, but then eventually somebody, decoded it. Okay, let's try this one. Jewish War 132. Herod had given a speech referring to the present famine, and now excited the Jews to fight the Arabians, offering sacrifices first, and then expanded on Antiquities 15:152, saying that Herod became ruler of the nation is victory, upon which 5,000 men lay dead upon the spot. And Luke 9:14, there were about 5,000 men who were hungry. Jesus had the men sit down, arranged in groups of 50, evoking an image of soldiers, a reference to how an army is structured. Then he took the 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and looking up to heaven, blessed them, offering sacrifices. So those are the parallels: offering sacrifices, 5,000 as in soldiers arranged on the ground in one place that were hungry. Okay, let's see if we can flip the page and maybe see if we can squeeze in another one here. Okay, this is Jewish War 133. Herod was concerned by his important friendship with Antony. He traveled to Caesar and concealed nothing of the truth, describing how he had sent 10,000s of measures of corn to Antony, and said, I ask Caesar to consider how faithful I have been, rather than whose friend I have been. And this is matched up with Luke 8:4-11. A sower went out to sow his seed. The disciples asked, what might this parable be? Jesus said, to you is given to know the mysteries, meaning I am concealing nothing. But others will not understand that corn on the good ground represents those honest with good heart, having heard the word, kept it, and bringing forth fruit with patience. He says, meaning the provider of the corn reaps the benefit of being honest and faithful. Okay. That one I'm not really thrilled with, but it's there. Jewish War 136 describes Herod's wife, Mary, refused to lay with him, but procured a love potion and intended to imply the potion to him. And she was imprisoned for this crime. And when she was discovered, she was put on trial, and she tore her hair in distress. This is a match with Luke 7:37. In the city was a woman who was a sinner, and she brought an alabaster box of ointment and stood at his feet behind him weeping